The champagne glass slipped from Adrian's hand as his bride's laughter cut through the ballroom, cruel, sharp, delighted. While 6 months pregnant and barely able to stand, their maid was forced to dance for the entertainment of guests who would never see her as human. Hey there, my amazing story family. If you're ready to dive into a tale that will absolutely blow your mind, smash that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from, Maid, because tomorrow I've got another incredible story that you absolutely cannot miss. What happened at this millionaire's wedding will leave you speechless, and by the end you'll understand why sometimes the worst night of your life becomes the beginning of your greatest love story. So grab your favorite drink, get comfortable, and let's dive into this unforgettable journey together. The marble floors of the Blackstone estate gleamed like mirrors, reflecting the crystal chandeliers that cast rainbow fragments across walls lined with portraits of men who had never known want. Adrian Blackstone stood before his bedroom's floor-to-ceiling windows, adjusting platinum cufflinks that cost more than most people's cars. At 34, he possessed the kind of refined handsomeness that money could polish: sharp jawline, perfectly styled dark hair, and eyes the color of expensive whiskey. Today was his wedding day. "Sir?" His valet appeared in the doorway, holding a silk tie. "The photographer is requesting 5 more minutes." Adrian nodded, his reflection showing no trace of the emptiness that had gnawed at him for months. Isabel Montenegro was everything he was supposed to want: stunning, well-bred, connected to European nobility through bloodlines that mattered in their circles. Their engagement had been celebrated in Forbes and Town and Country. The merger of their families' businesses would create an empire spanning 3 continents. Yet, as he knotted the tie around his throat, it felt like a noose. His phone buzzed with congratulations from senators, tech moguls, and oil barons. Each message felt identical, hollow, the same people who would attend today's celebration not for joy, but to be seen at the event of the year. Adrian had learned long ago that wealth was a language, and fluency meant never revealing genuine emotion. The irony wasn't lost on him that he felt most alone on the day he was supposed to never be alone again. 5 floors below, in the estate's expansive service quarters, Lily Chen balanced a breakfast tray against her swollen belly, while her lower back screamed in protest. At 26, pregnancy had softened her delicate features, but couldn't hide the exhaustion etched around her dark eyes. 6 months along, every movement required calculation, every step a negotiation between her body's needs and the demands of her position. "Careful with that china," snapped Mrs. Pemberton, the head housekeeper, her gray hair pulled into a bun, so severe it seemed to lift her eyebrows. "Each plate costs more than your monthly salary." Lily nodded, swallowing the response that would cost her the job she desperately needed. The irony of preparing a wedding breakfast while her own relationship had crumbled 3 months ago wasn't lost on her. Jason had vanished the moment she'd shown him the positive test, leaving behind only empty promises and unpaid rent. Her hands trembled slightly as she arranged the roses, imported from Ecuador at crushing expense, around the bride's favorite china. Each bloom cost more than Lily spent on groceries in a week, but she'd learned not to dwell on such mathematics. They led to the kind of resentment that showed in her face, and showing anything other than grateful servitude was grounds for dismissal. "The bride wants her breakfast served at exactly 9 a.m., Mrs. Pemberton continued, checking her watch with military precision. "Not 8:59, not 9:01. And Lily," she paused, her gaze falling to the gentle curve of Lily's belly, "try not to waddle, it's unseemly." Heat flushed Lily's cheeks, but she simply nodded. She'd endured worse. Growing up in her grandmother's restaurant in Chinatown, she'd learned that dignity was something you carried inside, impervious to the cruelty of others. Her baby deserved better than this, deserved a mother who could provide more than scraps from rich people's tables. But dreams required money, and money required enduring humiliation with a smile. As Lily climbed the servants' staircase, her mind wandered to the letter hidden beneath her mattress, acceptance to the nursing program at the community college. The scholarship would cover tuition, but living expenses while pregnant and in school seemed impossible. The Blackstone position paid well by domestic standards, but not well enough to support a child while pursuing education. She paused on the landing, one hand pressed to her belly where the baby had begun to kick. "I know, little one," she whispered. "Mama's trying." Through the narrow service window, she could see the estate's grounds transforming into something from a fairy tale. White tents large enough to house aircraft dotted the manicured lawns. Florists arranged thousands of white roses and orchids into cascading displays that would bloom for one day and die forgotten. The cost of today's celebration could have funded her daughter's entire education, assuming the ultrasound was right about gender. A daughter. The thought filled her with equal parts terror and fierce determination. Lily knocked softly on the bridal suite's door. "Your breakfast, Miss Montenegro." "Enter." The door opened to reveal a scene of barely controlled chaos. Isabel Montenegro stood like a statue in the center of the room, while three women fussed around her, one touching up her makeup, another adjusting the beadwork on her gown, a third spraying her hair with something that smelled like expensive flowers. The bride herself remained perfectly still, as if movement might shatter whatever spell maintained her flawless appearance. At 28, Isabel possessed the kind of beauty that graced magazine covers, tall, willowy, with platinum blonde hair that caught light like spun gold and green eyes sharp enough to cut glass. Her wedding gown was a masterpiece of European couture, hand-beaded with thousands of pearls and crystals that transformed her into something between a princess and a frost queen. "Set it by the window," Isabel commanded without looking at Lily. "And be careful. Everything here is irreplaceable." Including herself, Lily thought, but kept her expression neutral as she arranged the breakfast service on the marble-topped table. The bride's morning meal consisted of exactly 4 items: half a grapefruit, precisely measured, 2 pieces of dry toast cut into triangles, black coffee and a single white rose in a crystal vase. It was the kind of breakfast that suggested food was fuel rather than pleasure, a necessary evil to be managed rather than enjoyed. "Will there be anything else?" Lily asked quietly. For the first time, Isabel looked directly at her, and Lily felt the chill of those green eyes like winter wind. They swept from her face down to her belly, with unmistakable distaste, as if pregnancy was a personal failing that offended refined sensibilities. "No," Isabel said, her voice carrying the dismissal like a physical push. "You may go." But as Lily turned toward the door, she heard Isabel's voice again, softer now, speaking to her maid of honor, but clearly intended to be overheard. "Really, Adrian should do something about the help. It's unseemly to have pregnant staff at such an important event. What will people think?" The words hit Lily like a slap, but she kept walking, her spine straight despite the weight of humiliation. Outside the door, she paused to steady her breathing, one hand protectively curved around her belly. The baby kicked again, stronger this time, as if responding to her mother's distress. "Don't worry," she whispered, "we'll be okay. Somehow we'll be okay." But as she made her way back down the servants' stairs, past oil paintings of Blackstone ancestors who had built their fortune on the backs of people exactly like her, Lily couldn't shake the feeling that today would change everything, though she had no idea how catastrophically right she was. What would you do if you found yourself in Lily's position, carrying a child while enduring daily humiliation just to survive? Have you ever had to smile through treatment that made you feel invisible? Share your thoughts below. Your story might inspire someone else facing similar struggles. The Cathedral of St. Helena had witnessed centuries of unions between powerful families, but none quite as ostentatious as the Blackstone Montenegro wedding. 800 guests filled pews lined with white silk, their designer gowns and tailored suits creating a sea of muted elegance punctuated by glittering jewelry that could have funded small nations. The afternoon sun filtered through stained glass windows, casting jeweled light across marble floors where Adrian stood at the altar, his smile perfectly calibrated for the cameras capturing every moment. He watched Isabel glide down the aisle on her father's arm, her train flowing behind her like liquid moonlight. She was breathtaking, a vision of everything his world valued. Yet as she approached, Adrian felt nothing but the hollow ache that had become his constant companion. This was supposed to be the happiest day of his life, and all he could think about was the quarterly earnings report waiting on his desk. The ceremony proceeded with clockwork precision. Vows were exchanged, words crafted by speechwriters to sound personal while revealing nothing genuine. Rings were blessed and placed worth more than most people's homes. Adrian kissed his bride as the organ swelled and guests applauded, and for the cameras it looked like a fairy tale come to life. But fairy tales, Adrian had learned, were just expensive illusions. The reception at Blackstone Estate transformed the gardens into something between Versailles and a movie set. Crystal chandeliers hung from trees older than the nation. A full orchestra played from a gazebo draped in 10,000 white roses. Servers moved through the crowd like ghosts, their black uniforms rendering them nearly invisible to guests too important to notice the hands that kept their glasses full. Adrian found himself swept along in a current of congratulations, business propositions disguised as small talk and social obligations that felt increasingly suffocating. Senator Williams wanted to discuss tax legislation over champagne. The tech mogul Harrison pitched a merger between courses. Even his wedding had become another networking opportunity. Darling Isabel appeared at his elbow, radiant in the golden hour light. Mother wants photos with the Belgian ambassador before sunset. The light will be divine. Adrian nodded, playing his part, but his attention was drawn to movement at the edge of his vision. The serving staff was changing shifts, and he recognized Lily among them, moving slower than the others, one hand occasionally pressed to her lower back. In her black uniform, she should have been invisible like the rest, but something about her quiet dignity made her impossible to ignore. After dinner, Isabel continued, "I have a special surprise for everyone, something to really make this wedding unforgettable." There was something in her tone, a sharp edge of anticipated pleasure, that made Adrian look at her more closely. But before he could ask, they were pulled away for another photo, another moment of performed happiness. Dinner was a 7-course symphony of molecular gastronomy that prioritized artistry over satisfaction. Adrian barely tasted any of it, too busy fulfilling his role as the gracious host, but between the 4th and 5th courses, as servers cleared plates with military efficiency, Isabel rose from her seat with the kind of smile that never touched her eyes. She tapped her champagne flute with a silver knife, the crystal ringing like a small bell across the garden. 800 conversations quieted as attention focused on the radiant bride. "Dear friends," Isabel began, her voice carrying the confidence of someone accustomed to commanding rooms. "Thank you for sharing in our perfect day. As a special treat, I thought we might enjoy some entertainment between courses." She gestured toward the serving area, and Adrian followed her gaze with growing unease. Mrs. Pemberton was escorting Lily toward the dance floor, the pregnant woman's confusion evident even from a distance. "You see," Isabel continued, her smile widening, "our dear housemaid has been telling everyone she used to dance professionally before her current situation. I thought it would be charming to give her a chance to perform for such a distinguished audience." The words hit Adrian like physical blows. He could see Lily's face now pale with mortification, her dark eyes wide with the kind of trapped desperation he'd seen in cornered animals. She was shaking her head, trying to back away, but Mrs. Pemberton's grip on her arm was firm. "Oh, don't be modest," Isabel called out. her laughter bright and cruel. I'm sure everyone would love to see what 6 months of pregnancy does for one's flexibility. The laughter that rippled through the crowd was like ice water in Adrian's veins. These people, his friends, his business associates, his family, were entertaining themselves with another human being's humiliation. And his wife, radiant in her wedding gown, was orchestrating it all with the casual cruelty of someone pulling wings off flies. "Dance, dear," Isabel commanded, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent garden. "Don't keep our guests waiting." Lily stood in the center of the dance floor, surrounded by 800 pairs of eyes that saw her not as a person but as a curiosity. Her hands instinctively curved around her belly, protecting the life growing inside her from the judgment that pressed against her from all sides. Adrian could see her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths, could see the moment she realized there was no escape. The orchestra, at Isabel's gesture, began playing a waltz, something light and mocking that turned the moment into even more of a spectacle. And then, because she needed this job, because she had no choice, because the world had left her no room for dignity, Lily began to dance. It wasn't the professional dance Isabel had mockingly referenced, it was the careful limited movement of a woman 6 months pregnant, trying to preserve what little grace she could while her body betrayed her at every turn. She swayed slightly, her movements constrained by her condition, her face burning with shame that Adrian could feel like heat radiating from across the garden. The crowd watched with the fascination people reserved for car accidents, horrified but unable to look away. Some laughed behind their hands, others whispered to their companions. A few looked genuinely uncomfortable but said nothing, because challenging Isabel Montenegro on her wedding day would be social suicide. Adrian watched his bride's face throughout the performance, saw the genuine pleasure she took in another person's degradation, and felt something fundamental shift inside his chest. The woman he had married, the woman he had chosen to build a life with, was capable of cruelty that turned his stomach. "Marvelous," Isabel clapped as Lily finally stopped, tears streaming down her cheeks, despite her attempts to maintain composure. "What a treat. You may go now, dear." The dismissal was like a final slap. Lily tried to walk away with whatever dignity remained, but her pregnancy made quick escape impossible. She moved slowly, laboriously, while 800 people watched her retreat, like a wounded animal seeking shelter. That's when Adrian's champagne glass slipped from his nerveless fingers. The sound of crystal shattering on stone cut through the garden's murmur like a gunshot. In the sudden silence that followed, Adrian felt 800 pairs of eyes turn toward him, saw his wife's expression shift from triumph to concern as she registered something dangerous in his face. "Adrian." Isabel's voice was carefully modulated, but he could hear the edge underneath. "Darling, are you all right?" He wasn't all right. He would never be all right again. Because in that moment, watching Lily disappear into the shadows beyond the dance floor, Adrian realized he had married a monster, and worse, he realized what that made him. Have you ever witnessed someone being humiliated and felt torn between speaking up and protecting yourself? What would you have done in Adrian's position, stayed silent to keep the peace or risked everything to defend a stranger? The hardest moments often reveal who we really are inside. The silence stretched across the garden like a taut wire, 800 guests frozen in tableau as Adrian stared at the shattered crystal at his feet. Each fragment caught the golden light, creating tiny rainbows that mocked the darkness spreading through his chest. He could feel Isabel's eyes boring into him, could sense her calculating mind working to assess the damage to her perfect evening. "How clumsy of me," Adrian heard himself say, his voice carrying across the garden with practiced charm. "I'm afraid the excitement of the day has made me unsteady." The lie tasted like ashes, but it worked. Nervous laughter rippled through the crowd, and conversations resumed as servers materialized to sweep away the evidence of his moment of clarity. The show must go on, after all. These people had paid thousands in gifts and travel expenses to witness perfection, and a moment of authentic human emotion would spoil the illusion. "Darling," Isabel slipped her arm through his, her fingers digging into his sleeve with deceptive gentleness. "Perhaps you should sit down, you look pale." Adrian allowed himself to be guided back to the head table, his smile never wavering even as his mind reeled. This was the woman he had promised to love, honor, and cherish until death did them part. This woman who had just humiliated a pregnant employee for sport, who had turned another human being's vulnerability into entertainment for the wealthy and callous. "That was quite something," murmured James Hartwell, Adrian's college roommate and best man, as he leaned close. "Isabel certainly knows how to command a room." There was something in James's tone, disapproval carefully wrapped in diplomatic language, that made Adrian look at him sharply. But before he could respond, Isabel's laugh drew his attention back. "Oh, James, you should have seen your face. You looked positively scandalized." Her green eyes sparkled with amusement. "It was just harmless fun. The girl used to perform in some little community theater before she got herself into trouble. I thought it would be charitable to give her a chance to relive her glory days." The casual cruelty of it, the way she reduced Lily's dignity to harmless fun, the way she dismissed pregnancy as getting herself into trouble, made Adrian's stomach turn, but he found himself nodding along, his social conditioning too strong to overcome in public. "Of course," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his chest. "Very thoughtful of you." The lie felt like swallowing poison. In the kitchen's prep area, Lily sat on a plastic crate behind the industrial dishwashers, her face buried in her hands as sobs shook her shoulders. The sound of the reception continued outside, laughter and music and the clinking of expensive china, but it felt like it was happening on another planet. She had danced. In front of 800 strangers, she had been forced to perform like a trained animal, her pregnant body the object of their amusement. The memory burned through her like acid, their faces, some laughing, some uncomfortable but silent, all of them complicit in her humiliation. "There you are." Mrs. Pemberton's voice cut through her misery like a blade. "What are you doing hiding back here? There are dishes to be cleared." Lily looked up, tears still streaming down her face. "I can't, I need a moment." "You need to do your job." The older woman's face was granite, unmoved by tears or pregnancy or basic human decency. "Mrs. Blackstone's guests are waiting for their dessert course, and you're sitting here feeling sorry for yourself." "She made me dance," Lily whispered, the words scraping her throat raw. "In front of everyone, while you're what? Pregnant." Mrs. Pemberton's voice was sharp with contempt. "That's your problem, not Mrs. Blackstone's. She was kind enough to give you a moment in the spotlight, and this is how you repay her generosity." Lily stared at the woman in disbelief. Kindness? Generosity? The complete inversion of reality left her speechless. Now Mrs. Pemberton continued. "Dry your eyes, fix your face, and get back to work. Unless you'd prefer to explain to your unborn child why mommy couldn't keep a job." The threat was clear, and devastating in its effectiveness. Lily wiped her face with trembling hands, pushed herself up from the crate despite her aching back, and returned to work. Because she had no choice. Because she needed this job more than she needed her dignity. But as she loaded dirty plates into the commercial dishwasher, her hands shook with more than exhaustion. They shook with a rage she had never allowed herself to feel. Rage at a world that treated her like she was disposable. Rage at people who had never known want making entertainment of her desperation. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if responding to her mother's emotional storm, and Lily pressed her hand to her belly. "I know," she whispered. "Mama knows. We'll get through this. We have to." But even as she spoke the words, she wondered how many more humiliations she could endure before something inside her broke completely. Back at the head table, Adrian mechanically went through the motions of being the perfect groom. He smiled at toasts, laughed at jokes, accepted congratulations with practiced grace. But beneath the performance, his mind kept returning to the moment when Lily had stood on that dance floor, surrounded by cruelty disguised as entertainment. He had done nothing. Absolutely nothing. The realization sat in his stomach like a stone. All his wealth, all his power, all his influence, and when it mattered most, he had been paralyzed by the very social conventions that had made him rich. He was no better than the rest of them, worse perhaps, because at least they could claim ignorance. He had seen the truth of what his wife was capable of and chosen silence over courage. "You've been quiet, darling," Isabel murmured as the orchestra began playing again. "Still thinking about your little accident with the glass?" There was something probing in her tone, a subtle interrogation disguised as wifely concern. Adrian looked at her, really looked, and saw calculation behind the beautiful mask. She was reading him, assessing his reaction, determining how much damage control might be necessary. "I'm fine," he said, leaning over to kiss her cheek for the cameras still capturing their perfect day. "Just tired. It's been a long day." She didn't sound convinced, but she accepted the lie because it was convenient. "Well, try to look happier. People will think you're having second thoughts about marrying me." The irony was so sharp it nearly made him laugh. Second thoughts? He was having first thoughts, perhaps the first genuine thoughts he'd had about their relationship in months, and every single one of them was telling him he had made a catastrophic mistake. But there were contracts signed, businesses merged, 800 witnesses to their union. His entire life was built on maintaining appearances, on never letting the mask slip. Even if he wanted to run, and God help him, he did, where could he possibly go? "Never," he said, the word tasting like betrayal of his own soul. "You're everything I ever wanted." Another lie to add to the collection. But lies, Adrian was learning, became easier with practice, even when they poisoned the person telling them. As the evening wore on, Adrian found his eyes searching the shadows where the serving staff moved. He caught glimpses of Lily, her careful movements, her professional mask firmly back in place, the way she kept one protective hand curved around her belly. She was working, performing her duties as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't been degraded in front of hundreds of people. Her resilience shamed him. Her dignity in the face of cruelty made his own cowardice even more inexcusable. "Stop staring at the help." Isabel's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the chill of Arctic wind. "People will notice." "I wasn't." "You were." Her smile never wavered, but her eyes had gone flat and dangerous. "And if you continue, I'll have to ask myself why my new husband finds the pregnant maid so fascinating. That would be unfortunate." The threat was delicately wrapped but unmistakable. Adrian forced himself to look away, to focus on the conversation at their table, to play his part in the charade of marital bliss. But inside, something was crystallizing, a cold, hard certainty that this marriage was already over, even if it had only begun hours ago. The question wasn't whether he would find the courage to act on that certainty. The question was whether he would find it before it was too late to matter. The grandfather clock in the estate's main hall chimed 11 times, its resonant tones cutting through the orchestral music that still floated from the garden. Most of the guests had moved inside for after-dinner drinks and dancing in the ballroom, their laughter and conversation creating a warm buzz that felt increasingly alien to Adrian. He stood at the edge of the festivities, champagne glass in hand, carefully held this time, watching his wife hold court among European socialites who hung on her every word like she was dispensing wisdom instead of gossip. "You look like a man at his own execution." James appeared beside him, nursing a scotch that was older than some of the junior guests. Not exactly the expression one hopes to see on a groom's face. Adrian forced a smile. "Just taking it all in. It's been quite a day." "That's one word for it." James's tone was carefully neutral, but Adrian caught the underlying tension. They had known each other since college, had been through enough together that James could read the signs of Adrian's distress, even when he tried to hide them. That business with the maid earlier, that was difficult to watch. The words hit Adrian like a physical blow. If James, diplomatic, socially conscious James, was commenting on it, then others had noticed too. Others had been as disturbed as he was, but like him, they had chosen silence over confrontation. Isabel was just trying to be inclusive. Adrian heard himself say, the lie burning his tongue like acid, give the girl a moment to shine. James studied him with the intensity of someone who had watched too many friends destroy themselves with justifications. Is that what you call it? Before Adrian could respond, a crash echoed from somewhere deeper in the house, the unmistakable sound of breaking china followed by a woman's cry of distress. Conversations paused, heads turned toward the sound, and Adrian felt his chest tighten with inexplicable certainty that something terrible had happened. Mrs. Pemberton appeared in the ballroom doorway, her usual composure cracked around the edges. She scanned the room until her eyes found Adrian, then approached with the kind of urgency that suggested crisis management was required. "Mr. Blackstone," she said quietly, her voice pitched low enough that only he and James could hear. "I'm afraid there's been an incident in the kitchen. One of the staff has taken ill. Perhaps you could step away for a moment." Adrian's blood turned to ice water. Which staff member? But even before Mrs. Pemberton's hesitation confirmed his fears, he knew. Something about the way the older woman's eyes flickered away, about the careful neutrality of her expression, told him everything he needed to know. "The Chen girl," Mrs. Pemberton said finally. "It may be related to her condition. We've moved her to the small sitting room off the kitchen to avoid disturbing the guests." Adrian was moving before conscious thought took hold, following Mrs. Pemberton through corridors he rarely traveled, the servants' passages that connected the parts of his house he never bothered to see. Behind him he could hear James following, and distantly he registered that they were drawing attention from other guests who had overheard the exchange. The small sitting room was really more of a closet with pretensions, a space where staff could take breaks away from the endless demands of service. It smelled of lemon polish and old upholstery, and in the center of it, curled on a worn sofa that had been relegated here when it was no longer good enough for the public areas, was Lily. She was conscious but pale, one hand pressed to her belly, while the other gripped the sofa arm so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Her uniform was disheveled, her hair coming loose from its careful arrangement, and her face bore the sheen of cold sweat that suggested she was fighting something beyond simple exhaustion. "What happened?" Adrian's voice came out sharper than he intended, cutting through the small space like a blade. "She collapsed in the kitchen while loading the dishwasher," Mrs. Pemberton reported with clinical detachment. "Probably just overexertion. These girls don't know their limits, especially in her condition." The casual dismissal of Lily's distress, reducing it to personal weakness rather than acknowledging the circumstances that had led to it, made Adrian's jaw clench. But before he could respond, Lily's voice cut through the tension. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice was barely above a whisper and trembled with the effort of speaking. "Just need a moment. I can get back to work." "You're not getting back to work." The words came out of Adrian's mouth before he could stop them, carrying an authority that made both women look at him in surprise. "You need medical attention." "Sir, I don't think," Mrs. Pemberton began, but Adrian cut her off with a look. "Call Dr. Harrison. Tell him it's an emergency." "The guests will notice if the family physician is summoned," Mrs. Pemberton protested. "It will cause talk." "Then let them talk." Adrian moved closer to the sofa, ignoring the way Lily's eyes widened with confusion and something that might have been fear. Up close he could see the exhaustion carved into her features, could see the way her pregnancy had taken a toll that went beyond the physical. "How long have you been having contractions?" Lily's eyes darted to Mrs. Pemberton, then back to Adrian, clearly calculating whether honesty was safe. They're just Braxton Hicks. False labor, it's normal at this stage. How long? Adrian repeated, his voice gentler but no less insistent. Since, Lily swallowed hard, her gaze dropping to her hands. Since the dancing. The words hit Adrian like a punch to the solar plexus. Since the dancing. Since his wife had forced this pregnant woman to perform for the entertainment of people who saw her as less than human. Since Adrian had watched it happen and done nothing to stop it. Jesus, James breathed from behind him, and Adrian realized his friend was putting the pieces together too. It's not serious, Lily said quickly, misreading Adrian's expression as anger directed at her rather than at himself. I just need to rest for a few minutes. The baby's fine, I'm fine, I can finish my shift. No. Adrian's voice was quiet but absolute. You're not working anymore tonight. Mrs. Pemberton, arrange for someone to drive her home. But the cleanup, Mrs. Pemberton began, will be handled by someone else. Adrian turned to face the housekeeper, and something in his expression made her step back. Miss Chen needs to rest, and she needs medical attention. Those are my priorities right now. Sir, Lily's voice was small, scared. I need this job. Please don't fire me because of this. I'll be more careful. I won't let it happen again. The fear in her voice, fear that her medical emergency would cost her the livelihood she desperately needed, made Adrian feel sick. This was his world, his system, his life built on the backs of people who couldn't afford to get sick, couldn't afford to be human, couldn't afford to exist without constantly proving their worth to their betters. You're not being fired, he said, kneeling beside the sofa so he was at her eye level. This close, he could see the individual tears clinging to her lashes, could see the way her hands trembled despite her attempts to appear strong. You're going to go home. You're going to rest, and tomorrow you're going to see your doctor to make sure everything is all right. I can't afford. It's covered. The words came out automatically, though Adrian hadn't consciously decided to say them. Consider it a work-related injury. Lily stared at him like he was speaking a foreign language. In her world, rich men didn't offer to pay medical bills for pregnant maids. Rich men didn't kneel beside beat-up sofas in servants' quarters and speak in gentle tones to women they barely knew existed. I don't understand, she whispered. Neither did Adrian. He didn't understand what was happening to him, didn't understand why this woman's well-being had suddenly become more important than maintaining the perfect facade of his wedding day. He didn't understand why her tears affected him more than his wife's laughter, or why her dignity mattered more than his reputation. You don't have to understand, he said. Just let us help you. But even as he spoke the words, Adrian could feel Mrs. Pemberton's disapproving stare, could sense James's confusion, could imagine the gossip that would spread if word got out that he had spent his wedding night tending to a pregnant maid instead of celebrating with his bride. The sound of heels on hardwood announced Isabel's arrival before she appeared in the doorway, her wedding gown sweeping behind her like a white storm cloud. She took in the scene, her new husband kneeling beside their pregnant employee, her wedding guests clustering behind her in the corridor, her carefully orchestrated evening disrupted by drama in the servants' quarters. What on earth is going on? Her voice carried the kind of icy control that Adrian was beginning to recognize as dangerous. And in that moment, trapped in a small room between his suffering employee and his furious wife, with 800 wedding guests waiting for their host's attention, Adrian realized that he was about to face his first real test as a married man. The choice he made in the next few seconds would define not just his marriage, but who he was going to be for the rest of his life. Isabel's presence filled the small sitting room like poison gas, her wedding gown transforming from bridal elegance to something predatory in the cramped space. Her green eyes swept from Adrian's kneeling position beside Lily to the obvious distress of the pregnant woman, and Adrian watched his wife's expression shift through calculation, irritation, and finally settling on a mask of concerned propriety. "Oh my," she said, her voice pitched perfectly for the small crowd of guests gathering behind her. "The poor dear, how terrible that she's taken ill on such a special day." But Adrian caught the flash of something else in her eyes, satisfaction. As if Lily's collapse was somehow fitting, a natural consequence of her earlier humiliation that Isabel found gratifying rather than concerning. "We need to get her medical attention," Adrian said, rising to his feet, but staying close to the sofa. "I've called for Dr. Harrison." On our wedding night, Isabel's laugh was crystalline, beautiful, and sharp enough to cut glass. "Darling, surely that's excessive. I'm sure it's nothing that can't wait until morning. These girls are stronger than they look." The casual dismissal reducing Lily to these girls like she was livestock rather than a human being in distress made Adrian's chest tighten with a rage he'd never felt toward his wife before. But before he could respond, Lily tried to push herself up from the sofa. "She's right," Lily said, her voice strained but determined. "I'm fine. I should get back to." "Sit down." Adrian's voice carried an authority that surprised everyone in the room, including himself. "You're not going anywhere until we're sure you and the baby are safe." The word babies seemed to hang in the air like an accusation. In their world, pregnancy was something that happened to other people, people who planned it, people who could afford it, people whose children would be wanted and celebrated. Lily's visible condition was a reminder of messier realities that their carefully curated lives preferred to ignore. "Perhaps," Isabel said, her voice taking on the dangerous edge Adrian was learning to recognize, "we should discuss this privately. James, would you mind ensuring our guests have everything they need? I'm sure they're wondering where we've disappeared to." It was a dismissal wrapped in polite language, but James hesitated, his eyes moving between Adrian and Lily with obvious concern. "Are you sure you don't need?" "We're fine," Isabel said firmly. "Aren't we, darling?" The question was loaded with expectation, with the weight of social convention and marital unity. Adrian felt the familiar pressure to conform, to prioritize appearance over substance, to choose his wife's comfort over a stranger's welfare. But as he looked down at Lily, her pale face, her protective hands curved around her belly, her obvious struggle to maintain dignity while her body betrayed her, something shifted inside him. For the first time in years, maybe decades, he felt the pull of something deeper than social obligation. "Mrs. Pemberton," he said without taking his eyes off Lily, "please show our guests back to the ballroom. Tell them we'll join them shortly." The dismissal of his wife's implicit command created a tension so thick it was almost visible. Adrian could feel Isabel's fury like heat radiating from her direction, but he couldn't bring himself to care. Not when Lily was fighting back tears, not when he could see the fear beneath her attempts at stoicism. "Sir," Mrs. Pemberton's voice carried disapproval that she was too well trained to express directly. "Perhaps Miss Chen would be more comfortable in her own quarters, away from the festivities." "She'll be more comfortable when she's seen a doctor," Adrian replied. "Until then she stays where I can make sure she's all right." The words created a ripple of shock through the small crowd. In their world, the help was invisible until needed, disposable when inconvenient. Masters didn't concern themselves with servants' welfare beyond its impact on efficiency. As the room slowly emptied, Mrs. Pemberton herding the curious guests back toward the ballroom with practiced efficiency, Adrian found himself alone with his wife and the woman whose distress was revealing cracks in his perfect life. "This is ridiculous," Isabel said the moment they had privacy, her careful composure finally cracking. "It's our wedding night, Adrian. Our guests are asking questions. The photographer wants pictures of our first dance as husband and wife, and you're playing nursemaid to the help." "Her name is Lily," Adrian said quietly, "and she's having contractions because of what you did to her earlier." The accusation hung between them like a blade. Isabel's eyes flashed with something dangerous, not guilt or regret, but anger at being called to account for her actions. "What I did." Her voice rose slightly before she caught herself, glancing toward the doorway to ensure they couldn't be overheard. "I gave her a moment in the spotlight. I was being kind." "You humiliated her in front of 800 people." Adrian's voice was steady, but carried an edge that made his wife step back. "You turned her pregnancy into entertainment for your amusement." "I turned nothing into anything," Isabel snapped. "She's a maid, Adrian. A pregnant maid who got herself into trouble and now expects us to coddle her because of it." I was reminding her, and everyone else, of the natural order of things. The casual cruelty of it, the reduction of Lily's humanity to her economic status, the assumption that pregnancy was somehow a moral failing that justified public humiliation made Adrian feel sick. This was the woman he had married, the woman he had promised to build a life with. "The natural order," he repeated, his voice hollow. "Yes." Isabel moved closer, her voice dropping to an intimate whisper that somehow felt more threatening than her earlier anger. "The order that made you rich, that gave you this house, that surrounded you with people who understand their place in the world. You've forgotten who you are, Adrian." "But I haven't." Before Adrian could respond, a soft sound from the sofa drew his attention. Lily was crying. Not the dramatic sobs that might have drawn sympathy, but the quiet, desperate tears of someone who had learned not to expect comfort. Her hands were pressed to her belly, and Adrian could see her lips moving in what looked like a whispered prayer. Without thinking, he moved back to the sofa, sinking into the chair beside it. "Lily, are you all right? Are the contractions getting worse?" She looked up at him with eyes red from crying and exhaustion, and for a moment, Adrian saw past her careful servant's mask to the woman beneath, young, scared, alone, carrying burdens that would have broken most people. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry this happened at your wedding. I didn't want to cause trouble. I needed the job so badly, and I thought I could handle it, but when she made me dance, when everyone was laughing—" Her voice broke, and Adrian felt something crack inside his chest. Here was a woman apologizing for being human, for having limits, for existing in a world that saw her only as a function rather than a person. "You have nothing to apologize for," he said quietly. "Nothing at all." "But I do." Lily's voice was barely audible. "You don't understand. I used to have dreams, you know. I was going to be a nurse. I had a scholarship to nursing school, and I was going to help people, but then I got pregnant, and everything fell apart." She paused, her hands smoothing over her belly with unconscious tenderness. "Jason, the baby's father, he left the moment I told him, just vanished like he'd never existed, and the scholarship required full-time attendance, which is impossible when you're pregnant and need to work to survive. So I ended up here, cleaning houses for people who make more in a day than I'll see in a lifetime." Adrian felt each word like a physical blow. Here was a woman who had wanted to heal people, to make the world better, reduced to scrubbing floors and enduring humiliation because the world had offered her no other choice. "I keep telling myself it's temporary," Lily continued, her voice gaining strength even as tears continued to fall. "That once the baby comes, I'll find a way back to school. But looking at you and your wife, at this house, at the way people like me are treated, I wonder if I'm just lying to myself." The honesty of it, the raw vulnerability of someone who had nothing left to lose, shattered something inside Adrian that he hadn't even realized was brittle. All his life, he had been insulated from real consequences, real struggle, real choice. His problems were abstractions, stock prices, and social obligations, and the endless pursuit of more wealth to add to wealth he'd never spent. But Lily's problems were immediate and visceral and human. She was fighting for her future and her child's future with weapons the world had systematically denied her. "You're not lying to yourself," Adrian heard himself say. "And you're going to be a nurse." The certainty in his voice surprised them both. Lily stared at him with something between hope and disbelief, while behind them, Isabel made a sound of disgust. "Oh please," his wife said. "Adrian, you can't save everyone, and you certainly can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved." But Adrian wasn't listening to his wife anymore. He was seeing Lily clearly for the first time, not as a servant or a problem or an inconvenience, but as a person with dreams and fears and a strength that humbled him. A person who deserved so much more than the world had given her. And in that moment of clarity, Adrian realized that saving Lily might be the first step towards saving himself. Dr. Harrison arrived 20 minutes later, his silver hair disheveled, and his usually immaculate appearance slightly rumpled from being summoned in the middle of the night. At 72 he had been the Blackstone family physician for over 3 decades, had delivered Adrian and seen him through childhood illnesses and injuries. But as he entered the small sitting room, medical bag in hand, his expression carried a bewilderment that Adrian had never seen before. "Adrian," he said, nodding to both Blackstones, "Mrs. Blackstone, I understand there's been a medical emergency." Isabel stepped forward with practiced grace, her hostess persona sliding into place like armor. "Dr. Harrison, thank you so much for coming. One of our staff members has taken ill and Adrian insisted on calling you despite the late hour. You know how he worries." The dismissive tone, suggesting Adrian's concern was excessive rather than appropriate, made his jaw clench, but he kept his focus on the doctor. "She's 6 months pregnant and has been having contractions," Adrian said, gesturing toward Lily, who had gone rigid with obvious discomfort at being the center of attention. "They started after a stressful incident earlier this evening." Dr. Harrison's sharp eyes took in the scene, the pregnant woman on the worn sofa, the tension between husband and wife, the unusual circumstance of being called to examine domestic staff. But professional discretion won over curiosity as he moved toward Lily with the gentle manner that had made him beloved by 3 generations of Blackstones. "Hello, my dear," he said softly, setting his bag beside the sofa. "I'm Dr. Harrison. Can you tell me how you're feeling?" Lily's eyes darted between the doctor, Adrian, and Isabel with obvious anxiety. The contractions have slowed down. I think it was just stress. I feel better now." "Stress can certainly trigger false labor," Dr. Harrison agreed, pulling out his stethoscope, "but let's have a look to be sure, shall we? When was your last prenatal appointment?" The silence that followed was telling. Lily's cheeks flushed with embarrassment as she avoided the doctor's kind eyes. It's been a while," she admitted. "The clinic downtown has a long waiting list for patients without insurance, and the emergency room is expensive, and I haven't been able to." She trailed off, the reality of her situation hanging heavy in the small room. Dr. Harrison's expression softened with understanding. He had treated enough wealthy patients to recognize the brutal mathematics of healthcare for those without resources. "Well then," he said gently, "let's consider this a belated appointment. Mrs. Blackstone, perhaps you'd like to return to your guests while I examine the patient. These things can take a while." It was politely phrased, but clearly a dismissal. Isabel's eyes flashed with irritation at being excluded from her own drama, but social convention demanded she appear gracious. "Of course," she said, her smile sharp as crystal. "Adrian, darling, surely you'll come with me. Our guests are wondering where we've gone." Adrian looked at his wife, beautiful, perfectly composed, expecting his obedience, and felt something fundamental shift inside him. For years, he had prioritized her comfort, her social needs, her version of what their life should look like. But tonight, watching her casual cruelty towards someone vulnerable, he realized that choosing Isabel's convenience over Lily's welfare would be another small death of his soul. "I'll stay," he said quietly, "to make sure everything is all right." The words created a moment of crystalline silence. Isabel stared at him with disbelief that slowly transformed into something dangerous. Adrian, she said, her voice carrying warning beneath its honeyed surface, I really think, I'll stay, he repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. For a heartbeat, Isabel looked like she might force a confrontation, but with Dr. Harrison present and the situation already precarious, she chose tactical retreat over open warfare. Of course, she said, her smile never wavering even as her eyes promised retribution. How thoughtful of you. I'll let everyone know you're attending to medical matters. She swept from the room with practiced grace, leaving behind only the lingering scent of her expensive perfume and the promise of consequences. Dr. Harrison waited until her footsteps faded before speaking. Now then, let's see how mother and baby are doing. The examination was thorough but gentle, Dr. Harrison's experienced hands checking for signs of premature labor while maintaining Lily's dignity with professional courtesy. Adrian found himself holding his breath, surprised by how much the outcome mattered to him. When had this woman's welfare become so important that her pain felt like his own? Good news, Dr. Harrison announced finally. The contractions have stopped completely, and the baby's heartbeat is strong. It appears to have been stress-induced false labor, as you suspected. The relief that flooded through Adrian was disproportionate to his relationship with Lily, but he couldn't bring himself to care about the inconsistency. She was going to be all right. The baby was going to be all right. However, the doctor continued, his tone growing more serious, you're showing signs of exhaustion and dehydration that concern me. When did you last have a full meal? A full night's sleep? Lily's cheeks colored with embarrassment. It's been a busy week. With the wedding preparations and everything. She's been working double shifts, Adrian said quietly, the pieces of her situation falling into place with sickening clarity. Extra hours to help with the wedding. Dr. Harrison's eyes sharpened with understanding. I see. Well, medically speaking, you need rest. Real rest. And proper nutrition. The baby is taking what it needs from your body, but if you don't take care of yourself, you'll both suffer. I understand, Lily said quickly. I'll be more careful. You'll take time off, Adrian said, the decision forming as he spoke. Starting tomorrow, a week maybe 2. Sir, I can't, Lily began, panic creeping into her voice. Paid time off, Adrian clarified. Doctor's orders. Dr. Harrison nodded approvingly. An excellent prescription. Rest, good food, and minimal stress are exactly what this young lady needs. He began packing his medical bag with efficient movements. I'll want to see you again in a week to make sure everything is progressing normally. Shall I have my office call you, or? The question hung in the air, highlighting the complexity of the situation. Lily couldn't afford private medical care, but Adrian had just committed to providing it. Social protocols were blurring in ways that made everyone uncomfortable. I'll arrange it, Adrian said simply. After Dr. Harrison left with promises to call if there were any concerns, Adrian found himself alone with Lily in the small sitting room. The sounds of the reception continued to drift from the ballroom, laughter and music and the clink of expensive crystal, but they felt like echoes from another world. I don't understand why you're doing this, Lily said softly, her hands smoothed over her belly in the protective gesture he was beginning to recognize. People like you don't usually care about people like you? Adrian finished, and she nodded, her honesty both brutal and refreshing. He considered the question seriously, trying to understand his own motivations. I used to think I was a good person, he said finally. I donate to charity, I pay my taxes, I employ people. But tonight, watching what happened to you, watching how people reacted, I realized I've been living in a bubble, a comfortable, expensive bubble where I never had to see the cost of my comfort. Lily studied his face with the kind of intensity that suggested she was trying to determine if his words were genuine. And now you see it. I see you, Adrian said simply. I see someone who deserves so much better than what the world has given you. Someone who should be in nursing school, helping people, instead of cleaning up after people who can't be bothered to learn your name. To his surprise, Lily smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her all evening. It transformed her face, revealing the warmth and intelligence that her professional mask had hidden. "Lily Chen," she said, extending her hand formally. "Since we're apparently doing this properly now." "Adrian Blackstone," he replied, taking her hand. Her palm was calloused from hard work, her grip firm despite her delicate appearance, "and we are definitely doing this properly now." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the absurdity of the situation settling around them like a strange kind of peace. Here he was, on his wedding night, holding hands with a pregnant maid in a servant's sitting room, while his wife entertained hundreds of guests in his ballroom. 6 months ago, the scenario would have been unimaginable. Now it felt like the most natural thing in the world. "Tell me about nursing school," Adrian said. "What kind of nurse did you want to be?" Lily's face lit up with the kind of passion he rarely saw in his world, where most conversations centered on acquisition rather than aspiration. "Pediatric nurse," she said immediately. "Working with children who are sick, helping them heal. Making the hospital a less scary place for them and their families." "Why children?" "Because they still believe in hope," she said simply. "Adults, we learn to accept limitations, to compromise our dreams, but children still think anything is possible. I want to help preserve that as long as I can." Adrian felt something twist in his chest. Here was someone who wanted to spend her life making the world better for its most vulnerable members, and circumstance had forced her into scrubbing floors for people who measured success in stock portfolios and property acquisitions. "What about you?" Lily asked. "Did you always want to be this?" She gestured vaguely at the opulent surroundings. The question caught him off guard. When was the last time anyone had asked him about his dreams rather than his achievements? "I wanted to be a teacher," he said, the admission surprising him with its immediacy. "Elementary school. I loved the idea of helping kids discover they were smarter than they knew, braver than they thought." "What happened?" "My father happened. The family business happened. Expectations happened." Adrian's voice carried 20 years of buried resentment. "I was supposed to multiply the family fortune, not waste my education on a teacher's salary. Do you regret it?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications neither of them was ready to examine fully, but in this small room, insulated from the world of expectations and obligations waiting outside, honesty felt safer than it ever had before. "Every day," Adrian said quietly. "Especially tonight." Lily's hand found his again, her touch gentle but grounding. "It's never too late to change course, isn't it?" Adrian looked around the sitting room, thinking of the ballroom full of guests, the marriage he'd entered hours ago, the life he'd built on foundations that were crumbling beneath him. "Some choices lock you in." "Some do," Lily agreed. "But others set you free. The trick is learning to tell the difference." For a moment, sitting in that small room with this remarkable woman, Adrian could almost believe she was right. Could almost imagine a world where courage mattered more than convention, where doing right was more important than looking right. But even as hope flickered to life in his chest, he could hear the music from the ballroom growing louder, could imagine Isabel's growing fury at his absence, could feel the weight of 800 guests expecting their host's return. The real world was waiting, patient and implacable as gravity. But for this moment, this brief, impossible moment, he allowed himself to believe that change was possible. The ballroom doors burst open with enough force to rattle the crystal in the chandeliers. Isabel stood silhouetted in the doorway, her wedding gown flowing behind her like a white storm, her face a mask of barely controlled fury that transformed her beauty into something terrifying. Behind her, a small crowd of guests had gathered, drawn by curiosity or concern, their faces reflecting a mixture of confusion and anticipation that suggested the evening's entertainment was about to take an unexpected turn. Adrian's hand jerked away from Lily's as if he'd been burned. The sudden severing of their connection felt like a physical wound, but he couldn't deny the automatic response, decades of social conditioning reasserting themselves in the face of his wife's rage. How touching, Isabel's voice carried across the small room with the precision of a blade. My new husband, missing from his own wedding reception, holding hands with the help in a servant's closet. The words hit like artillery shells, each syllable designed for maximum damage. Adrian rose from his chair, instinctively positioning himself between Isabel and Lily, though he wasn't sure if he was protecting his wife from scandal or Lily from his wife's cruelty. "Isabel, please," he began, but she cut him off with a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "Please what, darling? Please don't interrupt this touching moment. Please don't notice that you've been gone for over an hour while 800 guests wonder where their host has disappeared to." Her eyes, sharp as winter ice, swept over Lily with undisguised contempt. "Please don't mention that you're spending our wedding night playing nursemaid to a pregnant maid." Each word was carefully chosen, designed to humiliate and diminish. Adrian felt his chest tighten with a rage that surprised him with its intensity, but before he could respond, Lily struggled to her feet from the sofa. "Mrs. Blackstone," she said, her voice steady, despite the obvious effort it took to remain standing. "I'm sorry for the disruption. Mr. Blackstone was just being kind." "Kind?" Isabel's voice rose to a pitch that made the crystal in the nearby cabinet ring in sympathy. "Kind? Is that what we're calling it?" She moved deeper into the room, her presence filling the small space like poison gas. The guests behind her pressed closer to the doorway, no longer pretending this was anything other than the kind of spectacular social destruction they would discuss at dinner parties for years to come. "Do you know what your kindness looks like to our guests, Adrian?" Isabel continued, her voice dropping to the dangerous whisper that Adrian was learning to fear more than her screaming. "It looks like weakness. It looks like a man who can't control his own staff, who prioritizes the comfort of hired help over the respect of his peers." "She needed medical attention," Adrian said, his voice carefully controlled but carrying an edge that made several guests step back. "She's pregnant and was having contractions. And now she's fine." Isabel's smile was sharp enough to draw blood. "Dr. Harrison confirmed it was nothing serious. So tell me, darling husband, why are you still here? Why are you holding her hand and gazing into her eyes like she's something more than what she is?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, loaded with implications that made Adrian's skin crawl. He could see the calculation behind Isabel's fury. She wasn't just angry about his absence from the reception. She was threatened by something she had seen or sensed, some connection between him and Lily that challenged the natural order she was so determined to maintain. "I was making sure she was comfortable," Adrian said, but even to his own ears the explanation sounded weak. "Comfortable?" Isabel repeated the word like it tasted bitter. "How progressive of you, though I wonder what your shareholders would think about your sudden interest in staff welfare. What the business press would make of photos of Adrian Blackstone, on his wedding night, intimate with the help." The threat was delicately wrapped but unmistakable. In their world, appearance was everything, and the right photograph could destroy reputations that had taken decades to build. Adrian could see phones raised among the crowd of guests, could imagine the social media posts already being crafted, the whispered speculation that would follow him for years. "There's nothing intimate about basic human decency," Adrian said, but his voice lacked conviction. Because there had been something intimate about his conversation with Lily, something real and honest that his marriage had never contained. "Human decency." Isabel laughed, the sound echoing off the small room's walls like breaking glass. "How noble you sound, how principled. Tell me, darling, where was your human decency when you married me for my family's business connections? Where was your nobility when you agreed to merge our companies for mutual profit?" The words hit their target with surgical precision. Every accusation was true. Their marriage was a business arrangement, dressed up in romantic rhetoric, a merger of fortunes that served both their families' interests. Adrian had convinced himself that affection might grow from partnership, that compatibility might develop from shared goals. But watching Isabel's cruelty toward Lily, seeing the pleasure she took in another person's degradation, he realized that some gaps could never be bridged. Some fundamental differences in character were unbridgeable. "That's different," he said weakly. "Is it?" Isabel moved closer, her voice dropping to an intimate whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting. "You married me knowing exactly what you were getting, a woman from the right family, with the right connections, who understood how our world works. A woman who knows that maintaining order requires keeping people in their proper places." She turned toward Lily, who had pressed herself back against the sofa as if trying to disappear into the upholstery. "You," Isabel said, her voice carrying absolute authority, "will pack your things tonight. Your employment here is terminated." "No." The word came out of Adrian's mouth before conscious thought could intervene. "She stays." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the music from the ballroom seemed to pause, as if the entire estate was holding its breath. Isabel stared at her husband with disbelief that slowly transformed into something much more dangerous. "Excuse me?" "I said she stays." Adrian's voice was stronger now, fed by a rising tide of something that might have been courage, or might have been desperation. "Lily is a good employee who has done nothing wrong. She's not being fired for needing medical attention." "Lily?" Isabel's voice rose to a near shriek. "You're calling her by her first name now? How long has this been going on, Adrian? How long have you been playing Lord of the Manor with your little pregnant maid?" The accusation hit like a physical blow, not just because of its implications but because of the grain of truth it contained. Not the sordid reality Isabel was suggesting, but the emotional connection that had developed between them, a connection that transcended their social positions and threatened everything his marriage was supposed to represent. "There's nothing going on," Adrian said, but his voice lacked conviction because there was something going on, something profound and transformative that he didn't fully understand but couldn't deny. "Isn't there?" Isabel's smile was triumphant now, predatory. "Then prove it. Fire her. Right now in front of everyone. Show our guests that you understand the difference between a wife and a servant." The ultimatum hung in the air like a sword. Adrian could feel the weight of 800 expectations, could sense the phones recording every word, could imagine the social and business consequences of defying his wife so publicly on their wedding night. But he could also see Lily's face, pale with exhaustion and fear, her hands protectively curved around her belly, her dark eyes holding a dignity that wealth couldn't buy, and cruelty couldn't destroy. She wasn't asking him to save her, she had learned not to expect salvation from people like him. But she was watching to see what kind of man he really was beneath the expensive clothes and practiced charm. "I won't fire her," Adrian said quietly. The words seemed to echo in the small space, final and irreversible. Isabel's face went through a series of expressions: shock, disbelief, and finally a cold fury that made her beautiful features look carved from ice. "Then you've made your choice," she said, her voice carrying the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence, "and now I'll make mine." She turned toward the crowd of guests still pressed into the doorway, her smile returning with predatory brightness. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her voice carrying clearly through the small space and into the corridor beyond, "I'm afraid the evening has taken an unexpected turn. It seems my new husband has developed feelings for our pregnant maid, strong enough feelings that he's chosen to defend her over his own wife." The words detonated like bombs in the confined space. Adrian heard gasps, saw phones rising to capture the moment, felt the weight of social destruction settling around him like chains. This was character assassination performed with surgical precision. Isabel was destroying his reputation with the casual efficiency of someone swatting a fly. "That's not," Adrian began, but Isabel wasn't finished. "Of course I understand completely," she continued, her voice dripping with false sympathy. Men can be so vulnerable to certain appeals, especially from young women in distressed circumstances. It's almost touching, really, how predictable it is. She turned back to Lily, whose face had gone white with horror as she realized she was being positioned as a homewrecker, a seductress who had manipulated a wealthy man's kindness for personal gain. "I hope it was worth it, dear," Isabel said with poisonous sweetness. "Though I'm afraid your employment here is still terminated, effective immediately, and given the circumstances, I doubt you'll find it easy to secure similar positions elsewhere. Word travels quickly in our circles." The threat was comprehensive and devastating. Not only was Lily being fired, but Isabel was promising to destroy her reputation throughout their social network, ensuring that no other wealthy family would hire her. It was economic warfare waged against someone who had no defenses, no resources, no way to fight back. "Isabel, stop." Adrian's voice was hoarse with desperation. "This isn't about her. This is about us, about what kind of people we are." "No, darling," Isabel's smile was sharp as a razor. "This is about what kind of people you are. I know exactly what I am. I'm a woman who protects what's hers and maintains proper order. You apparently are a man who throws away everything he's worked for to play savior to someone who will never be worthy of the sacrifice." She gathered her wedding gown around her like armor, preparing for her triumphant exit. "Enjoy your noble gesture, Adrian. I hope it keeps you warm when you're sleeping alone for the rest of your marriage." The words hit their target with devastating accuracy. As Isabel swept from the room with her audience of fascinated guests trailing behind her, Adrian felt the weight of what he had lost, and what he had chosen settling around him like lead. In the sudden silence that followed, he turned to look at Lily. She was crying again, but these weren't the tears of physical pain or exhaustion. These were tears of devastation, of a woman who had watched her life destroyed as collateral damage in someone else's marital conflict. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry this happened. I never wanted." But Adrian wasn't listening. He was staring at the doorway where his wife had disappeared, where his old life had ended and something terrifying and unknown had begun. For the first time in his carefully orchestrated existence, he had chosen courage over convenience, principle over profit. And it felt like the world was ending. 3 days later, Adrian sat in his study, at 4 a.m., surrounded by the detritus of a life being systematically dismantled. Legal documents covered his mahogany desk, divorce papers that Isabel's attorneys had delivered with ruthless efficiency, business contracts being challenged by her family's lawyers, social invitations being quietly rescinded by people who had called themselves friends for decades. The aftermath had been swift and brutal. Photos from the wedding night confrontation had appeared on society blogs within hours. The headlines wrote themselves: "Wedding Night Scandal, Millionaire's Maid Obsession, Marriage Destroyed by Pregnant Help." Each article painted him as either a predator who had taken advantage of a vulnerable employee or a fool manipulated by a calculating woman. Neither version bore any resemblance to the truth, but truth was irrelevant when scandal provided better entertainment. His phone sat silent on the desk, its lack of activity more telling than any flood of calls might have been. In 3 days, not a single business associate had reached out with support, not one friend had called to hear his side of the story. The isolation was complete and deliberately orchestrated. Isabel's family wielded social influence like a scalpel, cutting him away from everything that had once defined his existence. The irony wasn't lost on him that he felt more alone in his mansion full of expensive possessions than he had felt sitting in that cramped servant's room with Lily. Lily. Her name had become a wound that wouldn't heal, a constant ache in his chest that made breathing difficult. He had tried calling her apartment, the address lifted from her employment file, but the phone had been disconnected. Mrs. Pemberton, in the brief conversation before she too had been dismissed by Isabel, had mentioned that Lily had packed her few belongings and left the servants' quarters the morning after the wedding, disappearing into the city like smoke. Adrian had driven through Chinatown twice, searching faces in the crowds, checking the small restaurant where her employment application said she had once worked. But the elderly woman behind the counter had looked at him with the kind of wariness that suggested she knew exactly who he was and what his presence meant for anyone who helped him. "She's gone," the woman had said in heavily accented English. "Smart girl, knows when to disappear." The words had hit him like physical blows. Lily was gone because of him, driven away by his inability to protect her from his wife's cruelty, forced to disappear because his attempt to help had only made her situation worse. Now, sitting in the pre-dawn darkness of his empty house, Adrian faced the central question that had been eating at him for 3 sleepless nights: what kind of man was he willing to be? The easy choice was surrender. Accept the divorce, take his settlement, rebuild his reputation slowly over the next few years. There were other women in his social circle, other business opportunities, other chances to create the kind of respectable life that his upbringing had taught him to value. He could chalk up the wedding night incident to temporary insanity, a moment of misguided chivalry that had cost him dearly, but taught him valuable lessons about knowing his place. The safe choice. The smart choice. The choice that every advisor and ally would recommend if any of them were still speaking to him. But sitting there in the darkness, Adrian realized that the easy choice would be another kind of death, the final murder of whatever spark of authenticity he had discovered, in that cramped room with a pregnant woman who had reminded him what it felt like to be human. He pulled out his laptop and began typing, crafting emails to investigative journalists who specialized in exposing the cruelties of the wealthy. If he was going to be destroyed anyway, he might as well make it count for something. The story he had to tell about systemic mistreatment of domestic workers, about the casual cruelty of the privileged class, about a system that ground up the vulnerable for the entertainment of the powerful, might not save him, but it could illuminate truths that needed exposing. As dawn light began filtering through the study windows, Adrian felt something he hadn't experienced in years: the satisfaction of choosing principles over preservation, truth over comfort. But first, he had to find Lily. Across the city, in a one-room apartment above a laundromat that smelled of industrial detergent and broken dreams, Lily Chen sat on the edge of her narrow bed, staring at the eviction notice in her trembling hands. 3 days of unpaid rent was all it had taken, 3 days since she had lost her job at the Blackstone estate and discovered that Isabel's threat to blacklist her throughout their social network hadn't been an idle boast. 5 interviews in 3 days, each ending the same way. Initial interest in her qualifications, then a phone call to check references, then sudden coolness and polite dismissal. Word had spread through the network of wealthy families with ruthless efficiency. Lily Chen was trouble, a seductress who had manipulated her employer, a disruptor who couldn't be trusted to know her place. The nursing program acceptance letter lay crumpled in the wastebasket beside her bed, another dream sacrificed to survival's harsh mathematics. Even if she could have found a way to pay for living expenses during school, the character references required for healthcare programs would have been impossible to obtain. Her future had been systematically dismantled by people who saw her destruction as a necessary lesson for anyone who might dare to step outside their designated role. Her hand moved unconsciously to her belly, where the baby had been unusually quiet since the night of the wedding. Dr. Harrison's warning about stress and nutrition echoed in her mind, but implementing his advice required resources she no longer possessed. The $27 in her wallet might cover food for 2 days if she was careful, but it wouldn't stretch to cover rent or prenatal vitamins or the kind of rest her body desperately needed. She had called her grandmother 3 times, hanging up before the call connected each time. The old woman's restaurant was barely surviving in the current economy, and adding a pregnant granddaughter and her soon-to-arrive child to the burden would sink them both. Lily's pride, the last thing she had left, wouldn't allow her to drag her family down with her. The baby kicked then, a strong movement that brought tears to her eyes. Throughout everything, this tiny life had remained constant, depending on her completely, while she slowly lost the ability to provide the most basic care. "I'm sorry, little one," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the laundromat's rumbling machinery. "Mama tried. I really tried." But even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, something stubborn in Lily's core refused to surrender. She thought about Adrian, not the wealthy man who had disrupted his perfect wedding for her, but the person she had glimpsed in that quiet conversation. Someone who had dreamed of teaching children, who had wanted to make the world better before circumstance and expectation had buried that impulse under layers of obligation. He had risked everything to defend her dignity. The least she could do was fight to preserve it. Lily reached for the newspaper she had bought with precious quarters, spreading the classified section across her knees. There had to be something cleaning offices at night, washing dishes in restaurants that didn't cater to the social elite, any work that would keep her and her baby alive until she could figure out the next step. She was still Lily Chen. She was still going to be a nurse, somehow. She was still going to raise her child to believe in hope and possibility and the kind of courage that prioritized doing right over doing well. The eviction notice crumpled in her fist as determination replaced despair. She had survived worse than this. She would survive this too. But as she circled potential jobs with a pen that was running out of ink, a small part of her wondered if Adrian was thinking about her, if he regretted his choice to defend her, if he understood that his moment of courage had cost him everything while saving nothing. The wondering felt like weakness she couldn't afford. By noon, Adrian had exhausted every conventional method of finding someone who didn't want to be found. Private investigators required time and discretion, luxuries that Lily didn't have if she was facing the kind of economic devastation that followed Isabel's social warfare. The employment agencies that served his social circle had politely refused to discuss former employees. The city's bureaucracy offered no help for someone without legal standing to make inquiries. But money, Adrian was learning, could still open doors even when reputation had been shattered. A generous donation to the community health clinic where Lily had mentioned trying to get prenatal care eventually yielded information about a young pregnant woman who had inquired about services for the indigent. An even larger donation to the homeless shelter where she might have sought temporary housing produced a social worker willing to make discreet inquiries. The trail led him through parts of the city he had never seen despite living here his entire life, neighborhoods where his wealth made him a target rather than a passport, where people like Lily struggled to survive in conditions that his class preferred to ignore. Each dead end taught him something about the vast gulf between his world and hers, about systems designed to hide poverty from those whose comfort depended on its invisibility. Finally, as the sun was setting over the city, casting long shadows across streets lined with pawnshops and check-cashing stores, Adrian found himself standing outside a building that housed 24 apartments above a laundromat. The social worker had mentioned a young pregnant Chinese woman who had inquired about emergency rent assistance, a description that might have fit dozens of people, but felt like the closest thing to hope Adrian had encountered all day. He climbed the narrow stairs, his expensive shoes silent on worn linoleum, following apartment numbers until he reached 2C. Through the thin door he could hear the sound of someone moving around, careful, deliberate movements that suggested pregnancy or exhaustion or both. Adrian raised his hand to knock, then paused. What exactly was he planning to say? What could he offer that wouldn't sound like the same kind of condescending charity that had driven her away from his world in the first place? The truth, he realized, the only thing he had left to give. He knocked softly, 3 careful taps that wouldn't startle but couldn't be ignored. The movement inside stopped completely, as if whoever lived there was holding their breath. Then, after a long moment, Lily's voice came through the door, cautious, wary, but unmistakably hers. "Who is it?" "It's Adrian," he said quietly. "Adrian Blackstone. I need to talk to you." The silence that followed stretched so long that Adrian wondered if she had somehow vanished, leaving him talking to empty air. But finally, he heard the chain being removed, the deadbolt turning, and the door opening just wide enough to reveal Lily's face. She looked exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness, the deep weariness of someone who had been fighting battles on too many fronts with insufficient resources. Her clothes were clean but worn, her face thinner than he remembered, her eyes holding the kind of caution that came from learning not to trust unexpected kindness. "You shouldn't be here," she said quietly. "It's not safe for you, or for me." "I don't care about safe anymore," Adrian replied, and realized as he spoke, the words that they were absolutely true. For a long moment, they stared at each other across the threshold, two people who had glimpsed something real and precious between them, trying to determine if it had survived the destruction that followed. Finally, Lily stepped back and opened the door wider. "Come in," she said softly. "But we can't stay here long. The landlord will be back soon, and if he sees you—" Adrian stepped into the small apartment, immediately struck by how different this space felt from his mansion, where his home was filled with expensive objects that meant nothing. This single room contained only essentials, but it felt more like a home than anywhere he had ever lived. "Lily," he began, but she cut him off with a raised hand. "Before you say whatever you came here to say," she said, her voice steady despite the obvious effort it required, "you should know that I don't blame you for what happened. You tried to help me, and it cost you everything. That wasn't your fault." The generosity of it, absolving him of responsibility when he had failed to protect her from the consequences of his choice, nearly broke what was left of his composure. "It was my fault," he said quietly. "All of it. I should have seen what Isabel was, should have stopped her before she could hurt you. I should have been braver sooner." "Should have, could have, would have," Lily said with a sad smile. "Those are luxury thoughts, Adrian. I can't afford them, and neither can you, not anymore." She was right. Of course, the past couldn't be changed, and regret was a privilege neither of them could afford, but the future, that was still theirs to choose. "What if I told you," Adrian said carefully, "that there might be a way to turn this disaster into something better, not just for us, but for other people like you who have been hurt by people like me?" Lily studied his face with the intensity of someone who had learned that hope was dangerous but couldn't quite give it up entirely. "I'd say that sounds like the kind of beautiful lie that rich men tell themselves to feel better about the damage they cause." Adrian smiled, recognizing the strength that had drawn him to her in the first place, the refusal to accept easy comfort when hard truths were more useful. "Then let me show you," he said. "Let me prove that some choices, even the ones that destroy everything, can still be worth making." Outside the window, the city lights were beginning to twinkle in the gathering darkness, each one representing a life, a struggle, a choice between surrender and courage. Inside the small apartment, two people who had lost everything began to imagine what they might build from the ruins. 6 months later, the spring sunshine filtering through the windows of the small community center felt like benediction. Adrian stood at the back of the room, watching Lily pin a newly earned nursing badge to the uniform of Maria Santos, a young mother whose story had become heartbreakingly familiar over the past months. Domestic worker, pregnant, abandoned by her employer when she became inconvenient. "Congratulations," Lily said, her voice warm with genuine pride. "The pediatric ward at Children's Hospital is lucky to have you." Adrian smiled, remembering the girl who had once scrubbed his floors while dreaming of healing children, now 6 months pregnant herself, and radiating the kind of confidence that came from purpose fulfilled. Lily had become exactly what she had always been meant to be, a guardian for the vulnerable, a bridge between despair and hope. The Lily Chen Foundation for Domestic Workers' Rights occupied a converted warehouse in what had once been considered the wrong part of town. But Adrian had learned that being on the right side of history mattered more than being in the right neighborhood. The foundation provided legal aid, job training, healthcare, and emergency housing for domestic workers who had been mistreated by their employers. More importantly, it had become a platform for exposing the systematic abuses that their former world preferred to keep hidden. "Mr. Blackstone," Adrian turned to find James approaching, his expression carrying the kind of wonder that had become familiar over the past months. His former best man had been one of the few people from Adrian's old life to seek him out after the scandal, and their friendship had deepened as James witnessed Adrian's transformation from hollow socialite to passionate advocate. "The Times reporter wants to know if you have a comment on the Pemberton indictments," James said quietly. "Apparently the federal investigation into labor violations has expanded to include 12 more wealthy families." Adrian nodded, unsurprised. The investigative series he had helped expose had started with one story about a pregnant maid forced to dance at a wedding, but the research had uncovered a web of abuse that stretched across their entire social circle. Mrs. Pemberton's systematic intimidation of staff, the wage theft, the threats of deportation used to silence complaints, all of it documented with the kind of evidence that came from victims finally finding the courage to speak. "Tell them I'm pleased that justice is finally being served," Adrian said, "and that this is just the beginning." It was true. The foundation's legal team, funded by Adrian's liquidated assets and staffed by idealistic lawyers who had found purpose in fighting for the powerless, had lawsuits pending against dozens of wealthy families. The social media campaigns had made #Dignity for Domestics a rallying cry that reached millions of people who had never thought about the lives of those who cleaned their houses and raised their children. But more than the legal victories or policy changes, Adrian treasured the personal transformations he witnessed daily. Women like Maria, who arrived broken and left empowered. Men who had been treated as invisible finding their voices. Children of domestic workers, who now believed they could become anything, doctors, teachers, lawyers, anything but invisible. Adrian. Lily's voice drew his attention back to the present moment. She was approaching with the careful gait of someone 6 months pregnant, her hand resting protectively on the curve of her belly where their daughter grew stronger each day. Their daughter, the miracle neither of them had dared to dream possible during those dark days after his wedding night. Their love story had unfolded in the margins of social destruction, built on shared purpose rather than romantic fantasy. When Adrian had proposed, kneeling in this same community center, offering a simple ring purchased with money earned from honest work rather than inherited wealth, Lily's yes had been the sweetest word he'd ever heard. "How did the interview go?" she asked, settling carefully into the chair beside him. "Good, I think. The producer seems committed to telling the whole truth, not just the sensational parts." The documentary about their story, working title The Wedding That Changed Everything, was scheduled to air next month on a major network. Adrian had insisted on editorial control to ensure that the focus remained on systemic issues rather than personal drama, but he knew their love story would inevitably become part of the narrative. He didn't mind anymore. Let the world see that real love could grow from ashes, that authentic connection was possible across any divide, that choosing courage over comfort could lead to happiness beyond anything his old life had offered. Speaking of interviews, Lily said with a smile that made his heart skip, "I have news from the nursing program director." Adrian raised an eyebrow, recognizing the tone she used when delivering particularly good news. "They want to offer you a position," she continued. "Teaching in the community outreach program, helping adults who never thought they could go back to school believe in their own potential." The words hit Adrian with unexpected force. Teaching. The dream he had abandoned at his father's insistence, the path not taken that had haunted him for 2 decades. But this version was better than anything he had originally imagined, working with students whose hunger for education came from necessity rather than privilege, whose success stories would ripple out to transform entire communities. "Are you serious?" he asked, though Lily's radiant smile already provided the answer. dead serious. They were impressed by your work with the foundation, by your ability to connect with people from different backgrounds, and they said something about how your story proves that it's never too late to become who you're meant to be. Adrian felt tears gathering in his eyes, something that would have mortified his former self, but felt perfectly natural now. In his old life he had measured success in stock portfolios and social standings, in acquisition and appearances. Now success looked like Maria Santos pinning on her nursing badge, like families staying together because legal aid had protected them from deportation threats, like his own daughter growing up in a world where her parents had chosen love over luxury. "What did you tell them?" he asked, though he already knew his answer. "I told them my husband would be honored to accept," Lily said, reaching for his hand, "but that he'd want to discuss it with me first, because we make decisions together." Together. The word carried weight that his former marriage had never possessed. He and Isabel had been partners in appearance only, their union built on contracts and conveniences that crumbled the moment real choice was required. But he and Lily had built their relationship in the crucible of shared sacrifice, choosing each other not for what they could provide, but for who they were when everything else was stripped away. "Yes," Adrian said without hesitation. "Yes to the teaching position. Yes to this life. Yes to everything we're building together." Lily's smile was radiant as she leaned into his embrace, their unborn daughter kicking against his palm as if approving of their choice. Around them, the community center buzzed with the kind of productive energy that came from people who had found their purpose, former domestic workers learning new skills, volunteers planning the next phase of their advocacy campaign, children playing in the daycare while their parents attended classes. This was what victory looked like, Adrian realized. Not the hollow triumph of wealth accumulation or social climbing, but the deep satisfaction of work that mattered, love that was real, choices that aligned with values rather than contradicting them. "I love you," he murmured against Lily's hair, the words carrying the weight of everything they had survived together. "I love you too," she replied, her voice soft but strong, "and I'm proud of us, proud of what we chose when choosing seemed impossible." Through the window, Adrian could see the city skyline where his former life had unfolded, the gleaming towers where he had once played games of power and prestige, the exclusive neighborhoods where appearance mattered more than substance. That world still existed, still operated by the same cruel rules that had nearly destroyed them both. But here, in this converted warehouse, filled with people who had learned that dignity couldn't be bought or sold, Adrian had found something his old life had never offered: the possibility of becoming fully human. 6 months ago, he had been a millionaire who owned everything and possessed nothing. Now he was a teacher in training who had lost his fortune but gained his soul. The trade, he thought as Lily's hand found his and their daughter moved beneath her mother's heart, had been more than worth it. "Should we go home?" Lily asked as the community center began to empty around them. "I promised I'd make dinner for James and his girlfriend tonight." Home. A 2-bedroom apartment above a bakery that smelled like fresh bread and hope. Furniture bought second-hand but chosen with love. A nursery painted yellow and filled with books about brave children who changed the world. "Yes," Adrian said, helping his wife to her feet. "Let's go home." As they walked through the community center, past walls covered with success stories and testimonials from people whose lives had been changed by their work, Adrian reflected on the strange alchemy that had transformed his wedding night disaster into the foundation for everything good in his life. He had lost a fortune and gained a purpose, lost a social position and found his true calling, lost a wife who saw him as a possession and found a partner who saw him as he really was. Most importantly, he had learned that love, real love, wasn't something that happened to you, it was something you chose again and again, especially when choosing was difficult. Walking into the spring evening with Lily's hand in his and their daughter safe beneath her mother's heart, Adrian Blackstone finally understood what it meant to be rich. Sometimes the worst moments of our lives become the doorway to our best ones. Have you ever had to lose everything to find what really mattered? How did choosing courage over comfort change your life? Share your story. Your courage might inspire someone else to make the difficult but life-changing choice.
In a world that often rewards conformity over courage, Adrian and Lily's story reminds us that authentic love requires authentic choices. Their journey from a humiliating wedding night to a purposeful life together proves that it's never too late to become who we're meant to be, and that the most beautiful love stories often begin with the bravest decisions. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one. Thank you for watching this story to the end.